My indirect connection with Gestalt therapy started in 1931 when my brother was born. He was born 1 year after me. We grew up very, very close, and eventually he got a social work degree and I got a degree in psychology, but while I stayed on the East Coast, he moved to Berkeley, California. And at some point, he met Fritz Perls. But now I want to start with Fritz Perls and Laura Perls' origins until my brother connects, and hopefully it'll all come together. So I don't know how much you know about the origins of Fritz and Laura. They both professionally lived in Berlin, although Laura was born in Pforzheim, and they met in Berlin, they married in Berlin, and they both were psychoanalysts, not working with Freud. I don't think either of them worked at all with Freud, but Fritz worked a lot with Wilhelm Reich. Laura, on the other hand, spent a lot of time in the dance and the theater communities. Her doctorate is in psychology. In the 1930s, as the Nazi regime took power and began to persecute Jews, they got out early. They moved to South Africa. Let me ask, is this old news or not? Is it worth going through this part? Yes. Okay, so they moved to South Africa about 1935, something like that, and they remained there until Fritz left right after World War II, which was 1946. I believe their daughter was born in South Africa, Renata, who I knew quite well. And their son, however, was born in New York, whom I also knew and know quite well. And his name is Steve, and I'll say a little more about him later. So they lived there and worked there. They were very well accepted, widely welcomed, and that's where they wrote Ego, Hunger, and Aggression, the first book that has Gestalt therapy flavor to it, although the term Gestalt therapy does not appear in the book. The term Gestalt therapy wasn't created until about 1950. The book, as published, states that it's by Fritz Perls, but according to my information, much of it from Laura, she had a lot to do with it and did a lot of the writing, but she was, at the time, somewhat self-effacing and let Fritz take all the credit. However, that may not be totally true. I've known Laura to exaggerate. In any case, that was published while they were still in South Africa. Fritz moved to New York City in approximately 1947, and Laura and Renata followed a couple of years later, and they established themselves at an address which is very famous to all New York Gestalt therapists, 7 West 96th Street, which is right off Central Park. It's a beautiful apartment, and it was in that apartment that the New York Institute was created. So in 1951, the book Gestalt Therapy, Growth and Excitement, or Excitement and Growth, I think it is, in the Human Personality, was published. I imagine it's been translated into German. Has it? Anybody know? Yes?
3 times at least.
3 times? You mean 3 different translations? Okay. And The authors are Fritz Perls, theoretically, Ralph Hefferline, who wrote the first part. He was a Columbia University professor, and he got connected with the Perls in their training programs, which I'll mention in a few minutes. And he took a lot of the Gestalt therapy exercises and experiments to his classes at Columbia University, where I went, by the way. And the first part of the book, at least in the English version, is different exercises and experiments in terms of developing awareness, body sensations, and so forth. It is not theoretical at all. The second part of the book in English, again, according to my sources, was primarily written by Paul Goodman. And Fritz was more of a consultant, not particularly involved in the actual writing. And that is probably true because of the nature of the writing. I don't know about the German translations, but in English, it's a very, very complicated, difficult, complex linguistic style. And sometimes in reading it, at least one of my meager intelligence, I have to read it read a sentence 3 or 4 times to get it, and actually read the book 3 or 4 times, which I have done. Most recently, about 3 years ago, I read it again. But not the first part, but the second part. So the book came out in 51, and as a result, the Perls got known to a small group of people in New York City, and they began training them using groups. And the training was strictly via group. And about 1955, they organized a little, and they formed the New York Institute for Gestalt Therapy, which is different from every other institute that I've ever heard of. It was widely influenced by Paul Goodman, who was an anarchist, and the institute although it had a certain amount of structure in order to qualify for nonprofit status in the state of New York as an educational organization, is how the original documents read, which I have seen. But the training was strictly in groups, and there was no courses given. There was no classes. There's no requirements. There are no papers. There's no certificate of completion or anything like that. And so that is what I know prior to my direct involvement, which was, let me check my notes and see if there's anything more I wanted to say. Well, I do want to say this. So Fritz left New York about 1953, I think, and he never lived in New York again. He and Laura had a very, very poor marital relationship, which I am pretty positive is true from what I've heard, and also from my close relationship with Steve Perls, their son, who hated him. And actually, at the 100th anniversary of Fritz's birth, there was a conference celebrating the 100th anniversary, and they made the mistake of inviting Steve to give the keynote address, and he was very honest and very open, and so he moved away. He also became a psychologist, but not a Gestalt therapist. He moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he's a lovely man. And as I say, he felt he was very, very traumatized during his childhood by his parents, more by neglect than by anything else. Fritz now off traveling, and Laura very busy. She was very busy. Laura was a very elegant and social woman, very cultured. When I would enter their apartment often during my training, where the training took place, she would be playing Bach very often, and she was very hospitable with coffee and cookies, and just the opposite of Fritz, who had a very boorish kind of persona. I'm sure he had his sweet side, but he hid it pretty well, as you may have noticed in some of the videos, if you've seen some of them. So Fritz moved to Esselen, and which was just being established at that time, the Esselen Human Development Center, I think they call it. Anyone been there? Esselen? It's right on the ocean, on the Pacific Ocean, on a hill, actually. In fact, at one point they had a bad mudslide, but it's a beautiful place with hot tubs, and it was very avant-garde, or what's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, people would, be nude and be in hot tubs together, and all kinds of sexual activity. And Fritz taught there for a long time. He also slept with a number of the people he was teaching with. And unfortunately, a number of Fritz imitators emerged. They took a training or a weekend or two with Fritz, and then they established themselves as Gestalt therapists. And for many years, and to this day, Gestalt therapy has a very bad name with many people in the mental health field in the United States because of the image of it as being boundary crossing, boundary violating, being wild, being impulsive in the treatment programs, and so forth. All of that has changed, but the stain still exists. So meanwhile, Laura stayed in New York. She never left New York until, I think it was 1985. She returned to Pforzheim, where she spent the last few years of her life. And she carried on. She was the president in perpetuity of the New York Institute. She was always the president, but she didn't do any work. And there was always a vice president who did all the work for the Institute, and a treasurer and a secretary. And there was a board of directors, or a board of something, trustees, and there were 12 of them, and it was Laura and other people who had come up, Richard Kitzler, Isadore From, and they governed the Institute in the most autocratic way you can imagine. They held their meetings in secret. They made all their decisions without consulting the members. And they had this program of, there were two categories of membership at the Institute. Associate member, which is open to anybody in the world, Gestalt therapists or not, or any kind of therapist or not, and then full member. And they established this practice of anointing full members. So it turned out that, I'll get back to that. In 1971, I was in very bad shape, depressed and suicidal even. And my brother, meantime, on the West Coast, had met Fritz, and he had gone down to Esselen, and he had worked with Fritz, and he even tells a story of once from Berkeley to Esselen's about 2 hours. Fritz asked him for a ride. So he gave Fritz a ride from San Francisco to Esalen, and Fritz refused to talk to him the whole way down. So my brother didn't like Fritz, but he also acknowledged that he was a genius, and he also praised the modality very highly. About 5 years earlier than 1971, Fritz came to New Jersey, and I had an opportunity to spend a weekend with him, but I didn't know I did see a poster of this guy, with the long beard and the robes and everything. And, I thought, well, here's another West Coast New Age weirdo. So I did not go. A couple of friends of mine went and told me afterwards how spectacular he was in the work that he did, but I didn't attend that. So I knew about Gestalt therapy because of that a little bit, and then my brother urged me when I needed therapy myself. Prior to that, I'd had some psychoanalysis, but I didn't think it did me much good. So anyway, he recommended Laura to me. I contacted her, and after a little bit of difficulty, a few months, I was able to start working with her individually. And that fall, she invited me to join her training group. In the meantime, I had a PhD in clinical psych and had worked in a number of settings: clinic, school, private practice, a little bit of research in one instance, and was practicing privately, more or less in a manner of Carl Rogers, who I had discovered in college and who I admired greatly, and who was, before Gestalt therapy, he was the best thing going as far as I was concerned. So I joined the training group, and I spent 1 full year there in a normal kind of way. But the second year was very different. In the second year, I was with some of the people from the first year and some other people, one of whom was Ruth Renal, who I'll mention later. About 2 or 3 months into the season, which began in September, Laura became seriously ill. And I know she went into the hospital, I know she had surgery, and I know she went to recover in Englewood, New Jersey, at her daughter Renata's house. But beyond that, I don't know, and nobody ever was told. It was kept secret what was wrong. I mean, I can guess, there was some kind of cancer or whatever, or a hysterectomy, I don't know. But as a result, she was unable to work for about 3 months. She had 2 groups at the time, and one group disbanded for the duration of her illness until she was ready to go back to work. But my group decided we're going to carry on without her. And there were about 10 or 12 of us. You probably don't know any of the names unless maybe Alana Rubenfeld. Does that mean anything? No. Okay, you wouldn't know. But there were some very experienced people. Most of the people who were entering training at that time were quite experienced. Practicing psychiatrists, practicing psychologists, social workers, art therapists, a lot of variety of experience. So my group decided we're going to continue, and what we're going to do is, I think there are about 10 of us. Every week, we met every Friday for a couple of hours. Every week, we would meet at one of our members' offices. And whose ever office it was would lead the group with his or her specialty. And there are a lot of specialties: bioenergetics, art therapy, what's it called, transactional analysis. Rogerian is what I brought with me. And so each of us led the group, although we also tried, we were not fully trained Gestalt therapists at this time. We were in the beginning of our second year of training. So we weren't trying to train each other in Gestalt therapy, but we wanted to stay together and work together, and we did. And it was great. It was so great that when Laura notified us that she was ready to go back to work, we decided we would instead invite her to join our group as a peer, not as a leader, but as a peer. And I was nominated because everyone knew I was her favorite. And I had that ability to do that. So I was Laura's favorite. And I was pretty nervous going to meet her at Renata's house because she was still living there, recovering. And to everyone's surprise, she agreed. And for the next 5 years, we were in peer group together with Laura and the people that I mentioned mostly. And it was mostly a very continuous group. And so it was a totally different, she brought, of course, her expertise in at times. And when it was at her house, she led it, her way and so forth. So we continued. So that was my training. It was 1 year of more focused Gestalt therapy training, and then 5 or 6 more years of this diverse training with a whole bunch of different people with different skills. And I had so much respect for Laura for being able to be modest enough, humble enough and what she said was, I'm training, I'm leading all the time. I need something for myself. So it made a lot of sense, So, what else do I want to tell you? The New York Institute then was being governed in this very autocratic way until 1990. This is from 1955, 35 years. So during the course of that 35 years, they had kind of worn themselves out being autocratic. Everyone had been vice president, which meant a lot of work, or treasurer, secretary. So they decided, let's ask one of the full members to do it, be the vice president. And they asked me, and I said, no. I said, I will not be part of an autocratic governance. And then they asked Carl Hodges and Dan Bloom, and everyone said, no, we won't do it. So as a result, we spent the next 2 years rewriting the constitution of the organization to turn it into a democratic group instead of an autocratic group. So from there on in, all meetings were open to everybody. People became full members through a process in which they were vetted by a subcommittee and then presented themselves to the entire membership and were approved or disapproved. Nobody was ever said no to in the final sense, but some people were say, we think you need to spend another year working on this or that or the other. But ultimately, all those people became full members also. The perks of full membership were you could be president, vice president. Let's see, by this time Laura had left, by the time that I'm talking about. So you could become president as well. You could receive referrals from the answering service. Only full members could. And you could boast, I'm a full member. So that took place in the early 90s. But the basic anarchic style continued. There were still no classes, formal classes, no required readings, no papers to write, no tests to take. You became a full member if other members decided you were ready to be a full member. And that continues to this day. So my own relationship with Laura became very close. I still miss her. She was a wonderful woman. She had her faults. She tended to brag a little too much, but she was a wonderful person. And we became very, very close friends. So that's more or less, let me see if there's anything else I wanted to tell you. Well, I do want to mention that the New York Institute is very praiseworthy, in my view, for being very socially active. It was the first organization in the United States to recognize homosexuality as a normal state of being, not a pathology. It took many years, more years, for the psychiatric and psychological establishments to realize that. But we were the first. The New York Institute members were very, very prominent in the you know about the Stonewall event in New York City? Stonewall is a gay club where mostly gay people went. And at the time, homosexuality was illegal, against the law, and could be prosecuted if it was desired. And it was in Greenwich Village, which became the New York center. Some lived elsewhere, but most of the homosexual members of the New York Institute. And I would say that when I was an active member, I'm not a very active member anymore, but while I was an active member, I'd say about half the members were gay, men and women, gay and lesbian. And so the Stonewall Club was raided by the cops about 1986, I think. And for the first time, the gay people resisted. And they, instead of allowing themselves to be arrested, they fought back, and it made the headlines, and it began the beginning of homosexual people in the United States organizing and becoming active, particularly because of the AIDS scourge. Many of our members died of AIDS. 1982 is when it first hit New York. I don't know about here. And I remember a couple of our members being sick and dying, and we didn't know why until a few years later when the virus was identified and treatment began, although it wasn't very effective for quite a while. I myself treated many people in New Jersey who suffered from AIDS and died. I even had the experience of one guy coming to my office and then for the first time and then dying before the next session. But I also had some pleasure in seeing a number of them survive. I have one client now who I started seeing in 1990, and I still see her occasionally, and she has been able to survive it. But it really decimated the New York Institute, and however, it intensified the activism. And the New York Institute was instrumental in leadership at what's called Identity House in New York, which is gay, lesbian, transgender center. So a lot of the New York Institute members, gay and straight, helped it was a peer counseling program, but the members of the New York Institute volunteered their time to supervise and counsel the gay peer counselors. So that is something that we're very proud of and which continues to this day. In one of my books called A Living Legacy, to Fritz and Laura Perls, one of the books I co-edited with Ruth Renault, there's a very wonderful chapter by Perry Klepner, who is straight, in his work doing group therapy with people with HIV virus and AIDS. So it's been a part of our culture from the very beginning to work in a socially active way. In case I've given a misperception, the New York Institute is not very large. The number of the members is not very large. I think at the most at one time there maybe were about 100 members, and it shrunk. And one of the reasons it shrank was the New York Institute leadership, Laura, Isadore From, Richard Kitzler, went to Cleveland, and they trained the people in Cleveland, some of whom I'm sure you do know, such as Irving and Miriam Polster. And the Cleveland Institute organized itself, though, in a very different way, more the way that so that was the second institute, the Cleveland. And most of the institutes that followed the Cleveland pattern more than the New York pattern, which your institute also does. I don't mean they imitate it completely, but it's much more structured, which I've heard a lot of woes about here. But anyway, so the Cleveland Institute was formed, and then institutes developed all over the states and then the world. And now Gestalt therapy is shrinking in the United States, partly because it's not recognized as a government-approved therapy. It's not rejected, but it's not recognized. For instance, I am a licensed Gestalt therapist, and my license permits me, to offer therapy to the general public. But I can do anything I want. And a lot of what I want is to do Gestalt therapy. I don't do Gestalt therapy with everybody. It depends, I have to believe they're able of absorbing it and working with it and so forth. But because of that, a lot of people have gone to other modalities which are government approved, like CBT and behavior mod and psychoanalysis. And some of the institutes, and then New York State passed a law which completely wiped out any recognition of the New York Institute. So people who come and train in the New York Institute get benefit, but they don't get anything that's stamped. Some of the other Gestalt institutes in New York City, there are 2 others now, there were 3, they offer psychoanalytic courses as well as Gestalt therapy courses, so they can slip under the small print of the laws that were passed. So many of the young people don't come to the New York Institute anymore. They go to the Gestalt Center for Psychotherapy, whatever. Some of them, once they graduate, then they come to the New York Institute, which meets once a month with one of our members or somebody invited presenting. And we have that kind of, and it's an open house, anybody can come. And so anyway, it has shrunk now to about 80, I think. It had been down to about 65. But one of the reasons, I want to see what, we have to get out of here. No, we're okay. there's a birthday party going to be taking place at 9 o'clock. And one of the reasons I'm not very active anymore is because other people, not me, decided they wanted to make the New York Institute an international institute. And so they have brought in members, some of whom you may know from other countries, predominantly Europe, but also Phil Brownell from Bermuda, although he's originally American, but people from France and Italy, and I think a couple from Germany. And to me, it has changed the flavor. To me, the New York Institute, particularly during my years of struggle, was my second family. And I felt a tremendous debt to the Institute but I kept avoiding being president until about 8 years ago. Somebody said, "You have never been president." So I felt enough of a debt to do that, and it wasn't the happiest 2 years of my life. Not something, I don't like that so much. A lot of paperwork, nowadays, a lot of emailing and newsletter reviewing. It's just not my thing, but I did it. And since I left the office of president, I have been a limited member. I go once in a while, but so much gets involved with what's happening between us and these other members, and how can we bring them in through video and so forth. It's lost to me my personal connection. The current institute no longer has the place in my heart that the original institute did. So that's about all I can think of. I'm very open to your questions or comments, if you have any. Yeah.
You mentioned Isadore From.
Isadore From, yeah.
He started as a patient of Fritz.
What's that?
He started as a patient of Fritz Perls.
Yeah, Isadore From, I don't know if you know who he is at all. He's an extremely brilliant guy with a background mainly in philosophy, I think. And he trained with Fritz and Laura, and then was anointed as not only a therapist, but as a trainer. And so he, particularly when Fritz and Laura, well, Fritz never continued. He only started in the New York Institute, but he never trained people after he left for the West Coast. So Isadore became one of the prime trainers of the Institute, along with a guy named Richard Kitzler, who happens to also be from New Jersey, also very brilliant. And the two of them hated each other. And for a long time, they dominated the monthly meetings, not the presentation, but afterwards. So I remember I was terrified. I wouldn't say a word because I know one of them was going to, whoever spoke, if the Isadore knew you were training under Richard, or Richard knew you were training under Isadore, they just cut you off at the knees, And unfortunately, that lasted a long time. Ultimately, they mellowed, and then Isadore died, and later Richard died. So that has modified. But it also has led to the Institute, the current culture of the Institute, which is very, very respectful. And we make a very strong effort, particularly with any new people, to make them welcome and to respect them, which a lot of people would come to one meeting and they'd see Richard and Isadore do their game and they never come back. And we knew that, but that's the way it went. So why did you mention Isadore? Did you know him or?
No, but I think he was was one of those trainers who he was.
Wait,
one,
let me put my hearing aid in somewhere, wherever I have it. Go ahead, I'll find it.
He was one of the trainers of Cleveland Institute.
Yes.
And so I see the connection from IG Würzburg and IG Wien to Cleveland and to Isadore From. And I was curious about this person who seemed to be I read this book about oral history of Gestalt therapy.
Excuse me, can you hear? Can you hear Vaclav? Because I can barely, but I have very bad hearing. So let's wait a second. Sorry. Right here somewhere. Okay, got it. By the way, I was also something of a favorite of Isadore's, but I think it was for a different reason. I think he had the hots for me. But he was very nice to me, even though I was closer to Richard. I remember I was surprised one day he invited me to have dinner with him, because I had stayed pretty clear of him because he could be so devastating. But he invited me for dinner, and he urged me, gave me a book from his library to read I think it's called 5 Years by Paul Goodman, which is about Paul Goodman's insights having to do with natural healing. So anyway, so you know that Paul Goodman worked, trained people at Cleveland. Okay.
Is that all right? Yeah. Well, to be honest, I think Isadore From is an important figure, and I wanted to know more about your connection with him.
Okay.
And but to be honest, I wanted you to come back to Laura.
Oh, okay. So I can't. I've told you pretty much what I can offer regarding Isadore, since I, for many years, steered clear of him until one day he invited me for dinner and loaned me this book, but he died a few years later, so I didn't really get to know him very well. What about Laura Moore can I possibly, I mean, what interests you more?
What kind of person she was? Well, in the books, when in the interviews, she's definitely a very interesting person, but she also seems to be very proud of her education, almost to a degree which is intimidating.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, she probably was. There is a documentary on her life. I think it's called Living at the Boundary, which is the name of the book of her short pieces, which was edited and issued by the Gestalt Journal Press. And there are Laura did not write extensively. She didn't write any books. She gave talks, which were either she had typed them out or they were recorded, some of which were included in this book. And she wrote a couple of short articles. And two of them are, to me, two of the best things ever written. One is called Conceptions and Misconceptions of Gestalt Therapy. And the other is called Aspects of Gestalt Therapy. I mean, I just cannot describe to you how insightful, and she wrote beautifully. It's her second language, but she wrote beautifully in English, how she wrote it. And it has so many gems. I call it Laura's gem, is what I call it. I encourage you to, and I on the clipboard here before you came, I wrote down information about some of the books some of the things I thought I'd mention or did mention. One is the documentary and it's by Christoph Weber in Berlin. Originally made in German and now with English subtitles. There's a book called Fritz Perls in Berlin by Bernd Bosian. Has anyone come across that book? It is spectacular. I mean, it's been many years since I read a book, a Gestalt therapy book, that really grabbed me, that I'm learning something. And it's written so beautifully and comprehensively. And it's called Fritz Perls in Berlin, but it's really about Berlin in the 1920s and the various people there, including Laura, Kurt Goldstein, Wilhelm Reich. It is a marvelous book, and I recommend it very highly. Yeah, Laura's book is called Living at the Boundary, and it's edited by Joe Wysong. I mentioned what we in New York, New Jersey, call the Bible. That's what we call Gestalt therapy, excitement and growth in the human personality. And most of us have, read it a number of times. And then the book that I published in 1980, Beyond the Hot Seat, Gestalt Approaches to Group. Well, I'll say something about Laura with regard to that. Ruth Renault and I were in Laura's group for a year and a half or so until the group changed. And during that time, we developed a major dissatisfaction with one aspect of her way of working, which was to completely ignore group dynamics. If people had a relationship outside of group that everybody knew about, there would be no discussion. If somebody disappeared, never came back, it would not be mentioned. One time, as I mentioned to the group I'm leading, she brought in a guest without asking us, a guy from Israel who stayed for 2 sessions, monopolized the time, and then disappeared. So there was no interest or attention to group dynamics. And as a result, we began to experiment with incorporating, because we were by this time beginning to do our own work. So we began to incorporate group dynamics, and then we found out that Cleveland also was moving in the same direction, notably Elaine Kepner, but other people. So about 1975 or so, we decided to edit a book, and we edited a book called Beyond the Hot Seat, which was originally published in 1980 in English and was translated into German, and the German title is Gestaltgruppen. I don't know the Gestaltgruppen, G-R-U-P-P-E-N. Am I pronouncing it close?
Great.
Okay. So you can get it in German as well, but I don't recommend it because it's okay, but in 2008, another person, I'll get back to Laura in a minute, another person, Ruth Renault, got sick and died between 1980 and 2002 or so. And another guy named John Frew and I decided to reissue the original Beyond the Hot Seat in a revised version, and we kept 6 of what we thought were the best articles, including one of mine, but of course I was biased about it. It's called Safety and Danger in the Gestalt Group. It's my favorite publication. And then we invited people. By this time, in 1980, I didn't know anybody outside the United States. So the people we invited, I invited 2 of my friends who lived in the same town to write articles in the first book on education, Gestalt therapy in the classroom, not knowing anything about George Brown out in Santa Barbara, and so forth. So it was a very provincial kind of book. Who did I happen to know? Who did Ruth happen to know? Fortunately, we knew Elaine Kepner, and she wrote the first chapter, which is also the first chapter of the revised book. But the revised book includes chapters from people from Europe, Australia, and so forth. Brian O'Neill, Sean Gaffney, Peter Phillipson from England, somebody from Italy, I think, I forget. I can't remember. But anyway, it's a much better book than the first book. It has not, however, been translated in English. So getting back to Laura, in the preface to the first edition of Beyond the Hot Seat in 1980, when Laura was still alive and not sick yet, and practicing, we mentioned why we did it, that we were not satisfied with the work that we've been doing with Laura. And, and we were both pretty worried. Ruth was also very friendly with Laura. The two of them used to go to concerts together a lot, both very involved in classical music. We were both worried that Laura would be pissed off at us, but she wasn't. And after a while, about a year later, she said, you know, you were right, and now I'm working more in that way. So she was a very generous person in that way. I'm sure if we'd done that to Fritz, you know, he never would have talked to us again, you know. What else about Laura can I tell you? What kind of person she was? She was very elegant, I said. She took great pride in her dress, which, of course, is very opposite from Fritz. They were just so opposite. It's unbelievable. But they never divorced. And sometimes when he came to New York, he would stay in their apartment. But she bad-mouthed him all the time. Bad-mouthed? Okay. So she was very elegant in her dress. She was very cultured, both in music and dance. She did fantastic dream work. Unfortunately, it's not on record. Nothing of hers is on record. I mean, nothing of work. There's some interviews. They're okay, but to see her work is just such a blessing. Particularly her dream work is just marvelous. I can't come close to it. She incorporated movement very much into her work, and sometimes she would ask a person, just walk across the room. And based on that little vignette, she would get all kinds of stuff going, you know, because of her familiarity with movement and dance and theater. So she was a very good cook, apparently a lousy mother. She had a lot of friends, she had a lot of lovers. That's all I can think of at the moment. Any other comments or questions?
Did she publish something about the dream work?
Dream work?
Yeah.
What about it?
Like, did you write something? Did you publish something?
Could you translate?
Did she publish something about dream work?
No, she never, I don't think so, in Living at the Boundary. The only thing she ever published is all in that one little book called Living at the Boundary. And I don't recall any dream work. Well, I say the only thing she ever published. A couple of the pieces in that book appeared in Gestalt Therapy Now, I think, by Fagan and Shepard, if you're familiar with that, which is a very nice early book of little pieces. But I don't think she ever published anything in dream work. Yeah. And it's very unfortunate that her dream work was not recorded, you know, live, video or filmed or whatever. But that's the way it is. Mm-hmm. So, anything?
One more question. What is Renate doing?
Sorry?
Renate, her daughter, what is she doing today?
Who?
Renate?
Oh, she died. She died about 2 years ago, I think. I knew Renata. I was not a friend of hers. I would rather not say too much about Renata, but except that she died a couple of years ago. She and Laura had a relationship, and when Laura was sick, Renata took care of her. But they had a very, very tempestuous relationship. And Steve had no relationship. Steve left the family and left the family for good. And so his children, Laura never met. Now, I think she did meet one of the grandchildren who on her own, when she was older, sought out Laura. Yes, I remember that now. And Laura and one grandchild got quite close. I remember that. Laura talked about her a lot, and she would visit Laura. But Steve, no, they were completely alienated, yeah. Yeah.
Is the way you work similar to Laura?
Is your way of work similar to Laura's?
Say it again?
Your work, is it similar to Laura's?
Well, I'd say there are things I've picked up from her, sure. More in my individual work. I don't think my group work benefits much from Laura because I diverge from her way of working. But in my individual work, I try to be a mini Laura, in many ways. But everyone has his or her own style. But I think a lot of my paying attention, as some of you in my group today, paying attention to body language, I think some of that is a consequence of my work with Laura and my experience seeing her work. I don't do dream work like she does. I do it in a very, very smaller way. I just don't have that. She would take a dream and just do so much with it. But I never mastered that, and so I don't do her kind of dream work. I would call it Gestalt dream work, but not in the sense of, some of the pieces in the dream. How are you, the dog in the dream, or that kind of thing, but not a lot. Mostly, I've developed a couple of other things. My favorite trick with a dream is to have something, and I don't bother with the tell it in the present kind of thing. I don't think it adds a great deal to it. It just means the therapist has to keep, you know what I'm talking about? Yes. But Laura did that. She was a very stuck to the rule that when you tell the dream, you tell it in the present. But I over time, didn't find that it added anything much. So I just let people tell the dream, and I may ask them a few questions after. And then my favorite trick is say, imagine this dream is a short story or a short film. Give it a title. And whatever the title is, to me, that gives us so much to deal with. I don't worry much about the rest of the dream. So it's a different way of working. But, yeah. And it's probably might be a lazier way, but I find it very, I do find it very effective. Maybe one of you in the group will bring a dream in tomorrow to try that out. I don't have Laura's, I don't have much of Laura's background in movement until about the same time I started Gestalt therapy, and I was 41 at the time. I started yoga, and I first practiced a very soft kind of yoga. But later on, I met a woman who practiced Iyengar yoga. Familiar with Iyengar yoga, which is a real intense in terms of the body and the movements and so forth. So I became very, very into Iyengar yoga. And eventually, actually, I took a training and I became a yoga teacher. And I use sometimes yoga. You too?
No.
And sometimes I use yoga poses. My favorite one to use is child's pose. Um, but I also could tell you a couple of stories about B.K. Iyengar.
Yes.
I took a week with him in he came in the U.S. once, and he offered a week-long course, which me and my lady friend at the time, who was a yoga teacher, took with the course. And we discovered why people who knew him well called, his initials are BKS, and they called him Bang, Kick, Slap. And I remember once when I was doing something, and he came up to me, and I could see he was about to hit me in some way. And I just, he backed off. I was pretty youthful and vigorous at the time. But he was a Fritz Perls. He was a lousy man, human being, and a genius, both. And I don't know why that goes together, but it does, yeah. Yes?
Are there some points that you would criticize on Gestalt therapy?
Quitting what?
Criticize?
Oh,
That you don't like on Gestalt therapy, that you would do different maybe?
anything that I would change?
Yes, or that you wouldn't like.
Well, certainly over the years, I became critical of the arrogance of Gestalt therapy, which was stemmed from Fritz Perls and Jim Simkin and maybe Bob Resnick at the time, which carried on for a long time. So it was considered good Gestalt therapy, to be arrogant and sarcastic and treat people, in a disrespectful way. So I didn't myself, even though I started when that was still going on, it didn't fit me very well. So I didn't really get engaged in it much, but I certainly criticized it and I think I'll take a certain amount of credit for the approach having changed a great deal. Not full credit by any means. Lynn Jacobs and Rich Heichner and some other people, also very much focused on the relationship and on the importance of a positive relationship rather than a top dog, underdog, as Fritz would say. Expressions I never use when I work, but so certainly I became critical of that. Critical of the boundary violating. I wrote another very good article. It's called Boundary Crossing in Gestalt Therapy, in which I make the case that it is okay in Gestalt therapy to cross boundaries when the goal and the effort is therapeutic rather than boundary violation, which is to do something for the therapist. The most easiest one, but there are many other ways, is sexual predatory behavior, which is a boundary violation. But I have crossed many boundaries with clients I have, which are in violation, which originally I'm a member of the American Psychological Association. And when I originally began working and so forth, the things I did were in violation of the psychological code. It has since changed. For instance, I would go to weddings and funerals of clients or clients' family. I would have dinner. If a client invited me for dinner, I would go for dinner. I played tennis with clients, but I practically always, when I played tennis, I stipulated that anything of therapeutic value would be brought back to the session. So, But as I say, the American Psychological Association has now made a real shift in stating that it is acceptable to have relationship with the client outside of the office under certain situations, certain circumstances. So it's kind of complicated, and I don't think we can go any. No, we have to get out of here. So we have 3 minutes to clear the room. So please, I'll put the chairs up. Thank you so much. So most of the chairs